The fluorescent lights of Terminal 4 hum like a live wire. My father's face is a shade of purple I have never seen before. It is the color of a burst vein. Robert Caldwell stands there. He is unruffled. He is a wall of expensive wool and cold intent. He adjusts his cufflinks with the precision of a surgeon. He doesn't look like a lawyer. He looks like an executioner. My mother is hyperventilating. The sound is wet and rhythmic. Her designer luggage sits between them like a barricade. Caldwell opens his leather portfolio. The snap of the metal ring sounds like a gunshot in the sterile air. He slides a document across the polished marble. It is a temporary restraining order and a notice of fiduciary audit. My father's hands are shaking so hard the paper rattles. This is the end of the dynasty. This is the moment the bank accounts freeze. This is where the lies stop working. 3 weeks ago the air smelled like stale tea and peppermint in Grandma Hazel's living room. The house was too quiet. It was the kind of quiet that feels heavy. It felt like dust settling on a coffin. She sat in her wingback chair. Her fingers were gnarled like old cedar roots. She held a bank statement. The numbers were printed in a font too small for her tired eyes. I sat on the ottoman. I watched her breath hitch. She had just transferred $30,000. It was the price of admission for the family trip to Italy. It was her legacy being liquidated in real time. She looked at me. Her eyes were clouded with cataracts but sharp with a sudden fear. She asked if the flights were booked. She asked if the villa had a room on the ground floor. I lied to her. I told her everything was handled. I didn't know then that my father had already diverted the wire transfer into a high-yield offshore account. He called it an investment. He called it protecting the estate. I called it theft. Grandma Hazel pulled a knitted shawl tighter around her shoulders. She talked about the Amalfi Coast. She talked about the lemons the size of softballs. She wanted to see the Mediterranean one last time before the lights went out for good. My father didn't see a woman yearning for a final sunset. He saw a line item. He saw a liquidity event. He treated her like a depreciating asset. I spent those 3 weeks documenting every conversation. I recorded the way he talked down to her. I recorded the way he laughed when she forgot where she put her glasses. He thought he was playing a long game of chess against a broken opponent. He didn't realize I was the one recording the moves. I was building a discovery file that would make a federal prosecutor weep. If you have ever felt your skin crawl because you realized a family member was a monster in a silk tie, hit the like button. I need to know I am not the only one who sees through the mask. The logistics of the betrayal were elegant in their cruelty. My father used a durable power of attorney that Hazel had signed in a moment of post-surgical haze 2 years ago. He didn't just take the money for the trip. He began a systematic sweep of her liquid assets. He moved funds from her money market accounts into a shell corporation registered in Delaware. He called it the Thompson Family Trust. In reality, it was a slush fund for his failing real estate developments. He was leveraging her twilight years to cover his margin calls. I sat in my room at night with a laptop glowing. I tracked the routing numbers. I watched the money bounce from New York to Georgetown to the Caymans. It was a digital shell game. He forgot that I was the one who set up his home network. He forgot that every keystroke was mirrored on my drive. I wasn't just his son anymore. I was a whistleblower in his own house. I met Robert Caldwell in a coffee shop that smelled like burnt beans and desperation. He specialized in elder law and forensic accounting. He looked at my spreadsheets for 10 minutes. He didn't say a word. He just took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He told me this wasn't just a civil matter. This was criminal conversion of funds. He told me that if we moved now, we could freeze the assets before the plane took off. He asked me if I was ready to lose my father. I told him I had already lost him. I told him I was just trying to save my grandmother. We spent the next 72 hours drafting the petitions. We worked in a basement office filled with the scent of old paper and justice. We were preparing a surgical strike. The airport was the kill zone. My father thought he was heading to a vacation. He was actually walking into a deposition. The morning of the flight was gray and drizzly. The sky looked like wet concrete. My father was in high spirits. He was wearing a linen suit that cost more than my first car. He was whistling a tune that sounded like victory. My mother was obsessing over the weight of her carry-on. She was worried about her jewelry. She didn't care about the woman sitting on the edge of the bed in the guest room. Grandma Hazel was wearing her best travel suit. It was navy blue. It was a bit too big for her now. She looked fragile. She looked like a bird made of glass. My father told her there was a problem with her ticket. He said there was a glitch in the booking system. He told her she would have to take a later flight. He said he would send a car for her in 2 days. It was a lie. There was no second flight. There was no car. He was leaving her at the curb. I stood in the hallway and watched him say it. He didn't even look her in the eye. He looked at his watch. He said they were going to be late for security. He kissed her cheek. It was a cold, dry movement. It was the kiss of Judas in an airport terminal. My aunt was already by the door. She was checking her reflection in the hallway mirror. She didn't even say goodbye. They treated Grandma Hazel like a piece of furniture they were leaving behind during a move. Something too heavy to carry. Something not worth the shipping cost. I felt a heat rise up the back of my neck. It was a physical sensation. It was the feeling of a bridge burning. I picked up Grandma's suitcase. I told her we were going to the airport anyway. She looked at me with a confused smile. She thought I was being helpful. She didn't know I was bringing the storm. We arrived at the terminal 40 minutes after them. The crowds were a shifting tide of humanity. I saw my father's tall frame near the premium check-in counter. He was laughing with the gate agent. He looked like the picture of success. He didn't see me approaching from the side. He didn't see the man in the charcoal suit walking 3 paces behind me. Robert Caldwell was carrying a briefcase that looked like it was made of armor. I led Grandma Hazel right into the center of their circle. The laughter stopped. It didn't just stop. It died. It withered on the vine. My father's eyes went from my face to the suitcase to the man standing next to me. He knew Caldwell. Every shady developer in the city knew Caldwell. He was the man you called when you wanted to settle a score. He was the man you feared when you had something to hide. The silence in the terminal became a vacuum. People started to slow down as they walked past. They could feel the tension. It was a static charge in the air. My father tried to recover. He plastered on a fake smile. He asked what we were doing there. He asked if there was a problem with the car. Caldwell didn't give him room to breathe. He stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He used the measured tone of a man who knows he has the winning hand. He introduced himself. He stated his purpose. He used words like malfeasance and breach of fiduciary duty. He used words like embezzlement. My mother's face went white. She looked like she was about to faint onto the linoleum. My aunt gripped her purse so hard her knuckles turned into white stones. They were trapped between the check-in desk and the truth. But then Caldwell paused. He looked at his watch. He looked at my father and said something that wasn't in the legal brief. He said there was one more thing my father hadn't accounted for. He said there was a witness they hadn't considered. My father sneered. He looked at me. He told me I was a child. He told me I didn't understand how the world worked. He said I couldn't prove anything. Caldwell smiled then. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a shark. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small, black digital recorder. He didn't press play. He just held it up. He told my father that the evidence wasn't just on a hard drive. It was in the room. He turned to Grandma Hazel. The world seemed to tilt. This is the moment where the hunter becomes the prey. This is the moment where the silence tells the biggest lie of all. My father looked at the recorder in Caldwell's hand and laughed. It was a dry, rattling sound that didn't reach his eyes. He told Caldwell that a digital recording wouldn't hold up in a family dispute. He said it was hearsay. He said it was a violation of privacy. Caldwell didn't blink. He leaned in closer. He told my father that in this state, one-party consent is the rule of law. He told him that every word spoken in that kitchen for the last 3 weeks was now part of a permanent record. My father's laugh died. It was replaced by a slow, creeping realization. He looked at Grandma Hazel. She wasn't the confused old woman he had left in the guest room anymore. She stood tall. She reached into her navy blue jacket and pulled out a second device. It was an identical recorder. She had been the one pressing the buttons. I had only provided the hardware. The blood drained from my father's face. He looked like a man watching his reflection shatter. He realized he hadn't been gaslighting a victim. He had been auditioning for a felony. Grandma Hazel stepped forward. She didn't look at my mother or my aunt. She looked directly at her son. She told him that she had survived a world war and the death of a husband. She told him she was not going to be survived by a thief. She spoke about the moral bankruptcy of a man who would trade his mother's dignity for a real estate margin call. The people in the terminal were staring now. The gate agents were whispering into their headsets. A security guard started walking toward us. My father looked around like a trapped animal. He was looking for an exit that didn't involve handcuffs or a courtroom. Caldwell opened the portfolio again. He pulled out a document with a red seal. It was an immediate freeze on the Thompson Family Trust. He told my father that the bank had already been served. The credit cards in my father's wallet were now nothing more than pieces of plastic. The first-class tickets to Rome were being flagged for cancellation. My father reached for his pocket. He wanted to check his phone. He wanted to call his own lawyers. Caldwell told him not to bother. He told him his firm had already contacted the Bar Association. There was a cloud over my father's license to practice law. The predator was being stripped of his teeth in the middle of a crowded airport. If you have ever watched a bully realize they are completely powerless, hit the like button. I want to see how many of you have witnessed a real reckoning. My mother finally found her voice. It was high and shrill. She started screaming about the vacation. She said they had worked hard for this. She said I was ruining the family. She tried to grab the recorder from Grandma's hand. I stepped in between them. I didn't push her. I just stood there like a pillar. I told her the vacation was over. I told her the house was next. Caldwell explained the terms of the audit. Every cent moved from Hazel's account had to be returned within 48 hours. If not, the civil suit would become a criminal complaint for elder abuse and grand larceny. My aunt started crying. It wasn't the cry of someone who was sorry. It was the cry of someone who had just realized their free ride was crashing into a mountain. She looked at her luxury shopping bags like they were bags of trash. The security guard arrived. He was a large man with a tired face. He asked if there was a problem. My father tried to regain his composure. He told the guard it was a private family matter. He tried to wave him away with his usual authority. The guard didn't move. He looked at Caldwell. He looked at the legal documents spread out on the check-in counter. Caldwell introduced himself as an officer of the court. He told the guard that we were simply serving papers. He said there was no violence, only a transfer of reality. The guard nodded and stayed. He became a silent witness to the collapse of my father's ego. My father realized he couldn't charm his way out of this. He couldn't bully his way through it. He was a man standing in a suit he couldn't afford anymore, surrounded by people who finally knew the truth. Grandma Hazel turned to me. She asked if we should go. She said the air in the terminal felt thin. I picked up her suitcase. We started to walk toward the exit. My father yelled after us. He called me a traitor. He told me I would never see a dime of his inheritance. I didn't turn around. I told him he couldn't give away what he didn't own. I told him the inheritance belonged to the woman walking next to me. We left them there. We left them standing in the ruins of their own greed. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sun was breaking through the gray clouds. It felt like the world was being washed clean. We got into the car Caldwell had arranged. Grandma Hazel sat in the back seat and closed her eyes. She looked tired, but she looked free. We didn't go back to the house. I had already moved her things to a suite at a hotel downtown. It was a place where my father couldn't find her. Caldwell sat in the front seat. He was already on his phone. He was talking to a forensic accountant. He was talking about clawing back the funds from the Delaware shell company. He was talking about a total asset recovery. I looked at Grandma in the rearview mirror. She was staring out the window at the city. She asked me if I was okay. I told her I had never been better. I told her the truth felt like a heavy weight had been lifted off my chest. She reached out and patted my hand. She told me that the truth is only heavy when you are trying to hide it. The hotel suite was quiet. It was a different kind of quiet than her house. This quiet felt like a fresh start. We ordered room service. We ate in silence for a long time. Then she asked me why I did it. She asked why I risked my relationship with my parents for her. I told her it wasn't a risk. It was a necessity. I told her that a family built on lies is just a house of cards waiting for a breeze. I told her I'd rather be alone with the truth than surrounded by people who view her as a paycheck. She smiled then. It was a real smile. It was the smile of the woman who used to bake me cookies and tell me stories about the old country. She told me she had a surprise for me. She told me the $30,000 wasn't the only money she had. She pulled a small, worn ledger from her purse. It was filled with handwritten entries dating back 40 years. It was a record of every cent she had saved, invested, and hidden. My father thought he knew her net worth. He was wrong. He had only seen the tip of the iceberg. The accounts he had drained were just the ones she used for daily living. The real wealth was tucked away in old bonds and gold certificates he didn't even know existed. She told me she wanted to go to Italy. But she didn't want to go with them. She asked if I would take her. She asked if I would be her protector. I felt a lump in my throat. I told her I would go anywhere she wanted. But the mystery wasn't over. As she flipped to the last page of the ledger, I saw a name I didn't recognize. It was a name written in red ink. It was a name that made Robert Caldwell go silent when I showed it to him later that night. It was a name that connected my father's real estate deals to something much darker than just a bad investment. It was a name that meant the airport confrontation was only the beginning. We hadn't just stopped a theft. We had tripped a wire on a bomb that was connected to the highest levels of the city's power structure. Caldwell looked at me and told me to lock the door. He told me that we weren't just dealing with a family drama anymore. We were dealing with a conspiracy. Caldwell traced the name in the ledger with a shaking finger. The name was Julian Vane. Vane wasn't a realtor or a developer. He was a fixer for the municipal pension fund. The red ink wasn't just a stylistic choice. It was a warning. Caldwell explained that my father's real estate failures weren't just bad luck. He had been borrowing from people who didn't use banks. He had been laundering Hazel's money to pay back interest on a shadow loan. My father wasn't just a thief. He was a middleman for a predatory lending ring. The room felt smaller. The luxury of the hotel suite suddenly felt like a gilded cage. I looked at the door. I checked the deadbolt. My father wasn't coming for us with an apology. He was coming with a team of people who couldn't afford to have their names in a grandmother's ledger. I asked Caldwell what our next move was. He didn't answer immediately. He was typing on an encrypted messaging app. He told me that the audit we triggered at the airport would act like a flare in a dark sky. The moment the Thompson family trust was frozen, Vane's people would see the light. They would know the money was gone. They would know exactly who stopped the flow. Caldwell told me we had 6 hours before the first legal injunction reached the city records office. After that, my father would be useless to Vane. And people like Vane dispose of useless things. If you've ever realized that the person you share a last name with has put your entire life in danger, hit the like button. I need to know how many of you have had to protect a legacy from the people meant to build it. Grandma Hazel sat on the edge of the bed. She looked at the ledger like it was a map of a minefield. She told us about a meeting she overheard 3 months ago. She was in the kitchen making tea. My father was in the study. He was shouting about a project called the Meridian. He was talking about rezoning laws and kickbacks. He was talking about a man who could make problems disappear. She thought it was just business talk. She thought it was just the way men in suits spoke to each other. She didn't realize she was listening to a confession. She started writing names down. She started tracking the dates. She wasn't just a grandmother. She was an accidental spy. She had been building a case against her own son because she knew he was digging a hole that would swallow them all. Caldwell stood up and grabbed his coat. He told us we couldn't stay at the hotel. The reservation was in his firm's name. It was too easy to track. He told me to pack Hazel's bag. We needed to move to a safe house he kept in the suburbs. It was a place with no paper trail. It was a place where we could disappear for a few days while the forensic team did their work. I felt a surge of adrenaline. It was the kind of energy that makes your teeth ache. I realized that the Europe trip was never going to happen. Not like this. We weren't going to be tourists. We were going to be fugitives of a corporate war. I looked at Hazel. She didn't look scared. She looked ready. She grabbed her knitting bag and tucked the ledger inside. We used the service elevator. The air smelled like industrial cleaner and old laundry. We moved through the kitchen of the hotel. The staff didn't even look up from their prep work. We reached the loading dock and slipped into a nondescript black SUV. Caldwell drove. He didn't use GPS. He knew the back roads of the city like the lines on his palm. He told me that my father had already tried to call his office 12 times. The messages went from angry to pleading to threatening. My father knew he was between a rock and a hard place. On one side was the law. On the other side was Julian Vane. He was looking for someone to blame. He was looking for his son. I watched the city lights flicker past the tinted windows. They looked like cold, distant stars. The safe house was a small brick ranch at the end of a dead-end street. It looked like every other house on the block. That was the point. Inside, the furniture was covered in plastic. The air was stale. Caldwell set up a laptop on the kitchen table. He told us to keep the lights low. He started pulling up the public records for the Meridian project. It was a massive residential complex on the waterfront. On paper, it was a miracle of urban renewal. In reality, it was a massive money laundering operation. My father had used Hazel's $30,000 to pay for a specific environmental report. It was a report that hid the fact that the soil was toxic. He had bought a lie. And he had used his mother's retirement to pay for the ink. I sat in the dark living room and watched the shadows on the wall. I thought about the family dinners. I thought about the Christmases where my father talked about integrity. It was all a performance. Every hug was a transaction. Every smile was a hedge against a future liability. I realized then that the audit wasn't just about the 30,000. It was about the millions that were buried under the concrete of the Meridian. If we broke the trust, we broke the project. And if we broke the project, we broke Julian Vane. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. We weren't just saving a grandmother. We were taking down a criminal empire. I wondered if Caldwell knew what he was getting into. I wondered if he was as brave as he looked. Caldwell called me into the kitchen. He pointed at the screen. He had found a link between the shell company and a local politician's campaign fund. The rabbit hole went deeper than he expected. He told me that this wasn't just a civil case anymore. He was going to call the FBI in the morning. He told me that once he made that call, there was no going back. My father would go to prison. My mother would be left with nothing. The Thompson name would be synonymous with scandal. He asked me if I was sure. He asked me if I could live with being the one who pulled the trigger. I looked at Hazel. She was asleep in a chair. Her hands were still curled around her knitting bag. I looked back at Caldwell. I told him to make the call. But then, the silence of the street was broken. It was the sound of a heavy engine. A car was idling at the end of the driveway. I moved to the window and peeled back the curtain. It wasn't a police car. It wasn't a taxi. It was a dark sedan with no plates. The headlights were off. Two men got out. They didn't look like lawyers. They were wearing tactical jackets and carrying heavy bags. They didn't walk to the front door. They started moving toward the back of the house. I realized then that my father hadn't just called his lawyer. He had told Vane exactly where we were. He had traded our lives for his own safety. The mystery was no longer in the ledger. It was in the backyard. And it was coming through the window. I didn't scream. There was no time for a panic that paralyzed. I grabbed Caldwell by the shoulder and pointed at the shadow moving past the kitchen window. His eyes went wide. He didn't reach for a phone. He reached for a heavy iron poker by the cold fireplace. He told me to get Hazel into the crawl space behind the pantry. I woke her with a hand over her mouth. She didn't struggle. She understood the language of silence better than I did. We moved like ghosts through the darkened hallway. I shoved her into the small, cramped space and piled boxes of old linens in front of the door. I whispered for her to stay still. I told her not to breathe until the sun came up. I felt like a man burying a treasure he wasn't sure he'd ever see again. The back door didn't yield slowly. It exploded inward. The frame splintered with a crack that sounded like a bone breaking. I stayed in the shadows of the living room. My heart was a drum in my ears. I watched the beam of a high-intensity flashlight sweep across the plastic-covered furniture. It caught the edges of the dust motes. It made the room look like a frozen sea. One man entered with a silenced pistol. He moved with a heavy, professional grace. He wasn't looking for jewelry. He was looking for the ledger. He was looking for the boy who had ruined a billionaire's weekend. I gripped a heavy glass decanter I had found on the sideboard. It felt pathetic. It felt like bringing a toothpick to a gunfight. Caldwell moved first. He wasn't a young man, but he was a man who had been pushed into a corner. He swung the iron poker at the lead man's head. It connected with a dull thud against a shoulder. The man didn't go down. He grunted and pivoted, leveling the barrel at Caldwell's chest. I didn't think. I threw the decanter. It shattered against the wall inches from the gunman's face. The glass sprayed like diamonds. It was the distraction we needed. Caldwell tackled the man, and they went down in a heap of wool and tactical gear. The second man was already coming through the door. He was holding a stun gun. The blue arc of electricity hissed in the dark. It looked like a trapped lightning bolt. I dived over the sofa as the second man fired. The prongs hissed past my ear and embedded themselves in the drywall. I scrambled for the kitchen. I needed a weapon that worked. I grabbed a heavy cast iron skillet from the stove. It was solid. It was honest. The man reached for me, his fingers closing around the collar of my jacket. I spun and swung with every bit of rage I had stored up since the airport. The pan hit him square in the jaw. It was a sound I will never forget. It was the sound of a closing door. He went limp. He hit the floor with a heavy, wet sound. I didn't wait to see if he was breathing. I turned back to the living room. Caldwell was losing. The first man was younger and stronger. He had his hands around Caldwell's throat. The silenced pistol was on the floor, sliding away toward the hallway. I didn't use the pan this time. I used my weight. I tackled the man from the side, knocking him off the lawyer. We rolled across the floor, knocking over a lamp that didn't turn on. He smelled like expensive tobacco and gun oil. He was a professional. He found a knife in his belt. The blade caught a sliver of moonlight. It was 6 inches of serrated steel. If you've ever looked at a weapon meant for your heart and realized your father paid for it, hit the like button. I need to know who else has survived a betrayal that cuts this deep. The blade sliced through the air. It caught the sleeve of my jacket. I felt a cold sting on my forearm. I didn't feel the pain yet. I only felt the heat. I kicked out, catching him in the shin. He didn't flinch. He was coming for my throat. But then, a sound came from the hallway. It wasn't the sound of a struggle. It was the sound of a click. A very specific, mechanical click. The man with the knife froze. We both looked toward the pantry. Grandma Hazel was standing there. She wasn't in the crawl space. She was standing in the middle of the hall. She was holding the silenced pistol she had scavenged from the floor during the fight. Her hands didn't shake. Her cataracts didn't matter. She had the man in her sights. She told him to drop the knife. Her voice was like dry parchment. It was the voice of a woman who had seen the end of the world and wasn't impressed by a man in a tactical vest. The man looked at her. He looked at the gun. He thought she was bluffing. He started to shift his weight. He started tensing his muscles for a spring. Hazel didn't hesitate. She didn't fire at his head. She fired at the floor an inch from his lead foot. The carpet erupted in a puff of dust. The sound was a soft cough. The man froze. He dropped the knife. It clattered on the hardwood. He put his hands up. He knew he was beaten by a woman who had nothing left to lose. Caldwell scrambled up. He used the man's own zip ties to bind his hands and feet. He did the same for the man in the kitchen. We were breathing hard. The house felt like it was vibrating. Caldwell looked at Hazel. He looked at the gun in her hand. He didn't ask where she learned to handle a firearm. He just took it from her gently. He told us we had to leave. Now. The men would have a backup team. They would have a check-in time. We had 10 minutes before the street was swarming with more than just 2 hitters. We didn't take the SUV. We took the man's sedan. It was parked 2 blocks away. It was a ghost car. We drove toward the state line. The heater was blasting, but I couldn't stop shivering. I looked at the wound on my arm. It wasn't deep, but it was a reminder. I looked at Hazel. She was staring out the window. She hadn't said a word since she fired the shot. I asked her if she was okay. She didn't look at me. She said that she had spent 50 years protecting my father from his own mistakes. She said she was done. She said the only thing left to protect was the truth. She reached into her knitting bag and pulled out the ledger. She handed it to me. She told me to look at the very last page. Not the names. The numbers. I flipped to the back. It wasn't a list of debts. It was a series of coordinates. They were map references for the Meridian Project. Next to them was a date. It was tomorrow. There was a note written in my father's cramped, frantic handwriting. It said the concrete was being poured at dawn. It said once the foundation was set, the evidence would be gone forever. My father wasn't just laundering money. He was burying something. Something physical. Something that Julian Vane couldn't afford to have found. The Europe trip wasn't just a way to steal her money. It was a way to get the only person who knew the truth out of the country before the site was sealed. The mystery wasn't in the bank accounts. It was under the dirt. The engine of the stolen sedan hummed a low, predatory note as we raced toward the waterfront. The sky was beginning to bleed a bruised purple. It was the color of a secret being forced into the light. Caldwell was white-knuckled on the wheel. He told me that if the concrete pour began at 5 a.m., we had less than 90 minutes to stop a permanent silence. My father wasn't just hiding toxic soil. He was hiding the physical remains of a fraud that went back a decade. The coordinates in the ledger pointed to the northwest corner of the foundation. That was the anchor point. That was where the evidence was hidden. Not literal bodies, but the shredded documents and bypassed safety sensors of 1,000 building code violations. If those were sealed, the Thompson name would stay clean, and the Meridian would rise on a bed of lies. We reached the perimeter of the construction site. It was a forest of steel rebar and yellow cranes. The air smelled of wet earth and diesel exhaust. Huge floodlights cut through the pre-dawn mist, making the skeletons of the buildings look like giants. I saw the cement mixers idling in a row. They looked like a line of tanks ready to advance. Caldwell killed the lights on the sedan and rolled to a stop behind a stack of shipping containers. He told me to stay with Hazel. He said he was going to find the site foreman. He was going to use the temporary injunction to shut down the pour. I watched him disappear into the shadows. I looked at Hazel. She was holding her knitting bag like a shield. She told me that her husband had built this city with his hands. She said she wouldn't let her son bury it with his greed. I couldn't sit still. I saw a black SUV pull up to the main gate. It wasn't the police. It was my father. He stepped out of the vehicle, looking frantic. His silk tie was loosened. His hair was a mess. He started shouting at a man in a hard hat. He was pointing at the northwest corner. He was demanding they start the pour early. He was trying to beat the sunrise. I realized then that Caldwell wouldn't be enough. The foreman wouldn't listen to a lawyer in a suit when the man paying his salary was screaming in his face. I opened the car door. Hazel grabbed my wrist. She didn't tell me to stay safe. She handed me the ledger. She told me to show them the red ink. She said the truth is a weapon, but only if you swing it. I ran across the uneven ground, my boots sinking into the mud. I bypassed the main gate and climbed over a pile of gravel. I reached the edge of the foundation pit just as the first chute of the cement mixer began to swivel. The sound of the rotating drum was a mechanical growl. My father saw me. He didn't look like a parent anymore. He looked like a cornered rat. He lunged at me, his shoes slipping on the slick clay. He yelled that I was a parasite. He said I was throwing away my future for a woman who wouldn't remember my name in a year. I held the ledger high. I didn't talk to him. I talked to the foreman. I screamed that the site was under a federal audit. I told him that if he poured that concrete, he was an accessory to a felony. The foreman hesitated. He looked at the legal seal on the back of the ledger. He looked at my father's shaking hands. My father tried to grab the book from me. We struggled at the very edge of the pit. It was a pathetic, desperate scramble. He wasn't a strong man. He was a man who had spent his life behind a desk. I pushed him back, and he fell into the mud, his expensive suit ruined. The foreman signaled the mixer to stop. The heavy drone of the machinery died down. The silence that followed was deafening. In that silence, the sirens began. They weren't distant. They were right outside the gate. Caldwell had made the call. The FBI wasn't waiting for the morning. They were here for the Meridian. My father sat in the mud and watched the blue and red lights reflect off the standing water. He didn't try to run. He knew the game was over. He looked at me with a hollow, empty stare. He asked me if I was happy. He asked if this was what I wanted. I told him I didn't want any of this. I told him I just wanted a father who didn't steal from his own mother. If you have ever had to be the adult in a room full of your own parents' mistakes, hit the like button. I need to know there's a community of us out there. The agents flooded the site. They moved with the efficiency of a storm. They took the ledger. They took the foreman's logs. They took my father away in plastic zip ties. The sun finally broke over the horizon. It hit the steel beams and turned them to gold. Grandma Hazel walked across the site. She moved slowly, but her head was held high. She stood at the edge of the pit and looked down at the spot where the secrets were supposed to be buried. She didn't cry. She just took a deep breath of the cold morning air. Caldwell joined us. He looked exhausted, but satisfied. He told us the freeze on the assets was permanent. The Thompson family trust was being dismantled. The money Hazel had worked for her entire life was coming back to her. He said there would be a trial. He said it would be ugly. But he said we had won the first round. We walked back to the car. The city was waking up around us. People were heading to work, oblivious to the fact that a dynasty had just collapsed in a muddy pit on the waterfront. Hazel sat in the passenger seat and looked at the map. She didn't look at the coordinates. She looked at the Amalfi Coast. She asked me if I still had my passport. I told her it was in my bag. She told me to drive to the airport. Not the one where we met the lawyer. The one with the international terminal. She said she wanted to see those lemons. She said she wanted to feel the salt air on her face before she forgot what it felt like to be brave. As we drove away from the ruins of the Meridian, I looked in the rearview mirror. My mother was standing by the gate. She looked small. She looked lost. She had chosen the wrong side of the line in the sand, and now she was on the outside looking in. I didn't feel pity. I only felt a strange, quiet peace. I had lost a father, but I had found my heritage. I had saved a life, and in the process, I had started my own. The road ahead was long, and the legal battles were just beginning, but for the first time in 3 weeks, I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I was looking at the horizon. And the horizon looked like Italy.
Have a story like this? Send it to us, and we'll share it with the world. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more true family drama. Thanks for watching.